Starting with a kinesthetic learning exercise for the superficial posterior compartment. Before we actually begin with these muscles themselves, there is one muscle that's separate from the posterior compartment, which really want to talk about at this point. This is the popliteus muscle. We mentioned it briefly in the previous podcast. This is the one that comes off of the medial-posterior aspect of the tibia, and the fibers will run and insert on the lateral aspect of the femur. And it actually passes into the joint cavity, as we mentioned from before. Remember, this is the unlocking muscle. So we mentioned the fact that when the knee is put into full extension, we get lateral rotation of the tibia relative to the femur. As a result, in full extension, it creates this screwing home mechanism that we talked about. So the first step in knee flexion is we need to unlock the knee. We have to immediately rotate the tibia, and that's the action of the popliteus muscle, is that when it contracts, it reverses this, causing a medial rotation, which allows unlocking of the knee and allows flexion to occur. First muscle that we'll be talking about with the superficial posterior compartment of the leg is the soleus. This has a fairly broad origin off of both the tibia as well as the fibula. And the fibers will run down to insert into the Achilles tendon, which then attaches to the calcaneal tuberosity. And so we see the fibers running in this direction. Gets its name from the fact that it resembles a fillet of sole. I'm not kidding about that. So it's a soleus. One important distinction here that we will mention is the presence of what's called the soleal arch. And this is that connective point that we see, the origin off the tibia and fibula, but it also creates a passageway. And so the popliteal artery, as it passes through the tibial nerve, a variety of those different structures, it will actually pass in through this arch area, and that's how it's able to access that intermediate space between the superficial and deep posterior compartments. Next muscle for us to look at is the gastrocnemius muscle. This has two separate heads, one coming off of the medial supracondylar region of the femur, and the other coming off the lateral supracondylar region of the femur. And from here, fairly prominent muscle bellies superiorly that then thin out and become tendinous inferiorly, as we saw in the previous diagram. And these will actually fuse and blend in with the soleus muscle to create that Achilles tendon, which we often talk about. So I'll just draw the fibers coming down to this point here and then tapering out. And at this point, it would all become tendinous. And the third muscle to look at in the superficial posterior compartment, this is your plantaris muscle. So it has an origin just proximal to the lateral head of the gastrocnemius. And then it projects down, and we'll actually see it pass in behind the medial head of the gastrocnemius and then emerge, and basically you should see it either along the medial border of the Achilles tendon or just deep to it on the inside. It will also insert on the calcaneus, but its insertion is a little bit separate from the soleus and gastrocnemius muscles. Now I'm going to look at the deep component of the posterior compartment. Three muscles for us to look at in this situation. I'm going to start with tibialis posterior. This muscle has a fairly broad origin point off of the lateral half of the posterior surface of the tibia, the interosseous membrane, and the medial portion of the posterior surface of the fibula. From here, the tendon is going to pass posterior to the medial malleolus and has a fairly extensive insertion point onto the tuberosity of the navicular bone, portions to all three cuneiforms, as well as the second, third, and fourth metatarsal bones. So when we draw it, it actually passes fairly medial relative to the medial malleolus, relative to a couple of other structures we'll be talking about in just a moment's time. Next muscle to take a look at is the flexor digitorum longus. It originates just medial to the tibialis posterior on the posterior surface of the tibia, and as anticipated from its name, it will insert on the distal phalanges of digits 2 through 4, very similar to what we saw with flexor digitorum profundus in the hand. What's interesting is it's actually going to crisscross with the tibialis posterior as it passes the medial malleolus. So when we look at these in the actual posterior compartment, the tibialis posterior is the most intermediate between the other two muscles we'll be talking about, but as it actually crosses the ankle joint, it's the flexor digitorum longus tendon that's actually most intermediate. So tibialis posterior ends up being more anterior in this situation. And as you can tell from the way that these two tendons interact, tibialis posterior is going to be responsible for plantar flexion, whereas flexor digitorum longus is going to assist with plantar flexion, certainly, but it's also going to be responsible for flexions of digits 2 through 4. Final muscle to be aware of is flexor hallucis longus. This comes off the posterior aspect of the fibula lateral to tibialis posterior. And again, the name kind of says what this muscle is going to do. It will actually just attach to the distal phalanx related to the great toe. And when we see this cross, it will actually cross lateral relative to the other two tendons underneath the sustentaculum tali. And so if you look at the sustentaculum tali in lab, you'll notice that it has a very smooth undersurface, and that's because it serves a bit as a pulley for contraction and the pull of the flexor hallucis longus muscle. Kinesthetic learning exercise now for the muscles of the plantar surface of the foot. Last kinesthetic learning exercise of the term, and it's a biggie, so this is going to take a while. To start with, the muscles on the plantar surface of the foot can actually be divided into 4 separate levels. Starting with the first and most superficial level, first muscle that we're looking at is flexor digitorum brevis. This muscle comes off of the medial process of the calcaneal tuberosity. As well, it'll also have an attachment to the deep surface of the plantar aponeurosis. And the belly itself projects anteriorly to form 4 separate tendons, which go through digits 2 through 4. And similar to what we saw in the hand with the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus, the tendons of flexor digitorum brevis are going to split and attach to the medial lateral aspect of the middle phalanx for each of these digits. So we are once again seeing a situation where we have distinct similarities between the hand and the foot. In this case, the flexor digitorum brevis being analogous to the flexor digitorum superficialis in the hand. And there we have the muscle belly back here. Okay, so that's the first muscle. Second muscle that we'll be looking at is abductor hallucis. This muscle is also going to come off of the medial portion of the calcaneal tuberosity and the plantar ponderosis. It also has a little bit of an attachment off of the flexor retinaculum that holds the flexor tendons in place along the medial aspect of the ankle. The muscle projects out medially and attaches to the medial side of the base of the proximal phalanx. And as the name implies, this muscle is going to be involved in abduction of the great toe. Third muscle to look at is the abductor digiti minimi muscle. This muscle is going to be coming off of the medial and lateral processes of the calcaneal tuberosity. And similar to what we saw for abductor hallucis, it's going to attach to the lateral aspect of the base of the proximal phalanx. And not surprisingly, based on its name, this muscle is going to be involved in abduction of, in this case, the little toe. This takes us into the second level, and in this case it is prudent to put in the tendon for the flexor digitorum longus because the two muscles that we'll be talking about have either an origin or an insertion onto this tendon. The first muscle that we'll be looking at is called quadratus plantae. Quadratus plantae actually has two separate heads, which both originate off of the deep plantar surface of the calcaneus, and they will project up, fuse, and will merge directly onto the tendon of extensor digitorum longus. The function of this muscle pulls directly backwards on the flexor digitorum longus tendon and corrects this tendency for it to pull the ankle obliquely and create this medial rotation of the foot. Next we have the lumbricals, very similar again to what we saw in the hand. In this case, the muscle originates by two heads off the adjacent surfaces of the extensor digitorum longus, and its tendon will then attach to the dorsal digital expansion, or the extensor expansion, along the dorsum of the foot. So its action is much more subtle than what we saw in the hand, but again, when we talked about it in the hand, we talked about this being the Egyptian muscle, which caused flexion of the metacarpal phalangeal joint because it passed anterior to this point, and extension of the interphalangeal joint. So same sort of thing here. Flexion of the metatarsal phalangeal joint and extension of the interphalangeal joints. Next muscle to look at is adductor hallucis. This muscle actually has two separate heads. First of all, we have an oblique running head that comes off of the base of the second through fourth metacarpal bones. But we also have what's called a transverse head, which comes off right at the junction of the metacarpal and phalanx at the metacarpal phalangeal joints of 2, 3, and 4, and it originates off of the interconnecting ligaments here, so the metatarsal phalangeal ligaments and the deep transverse metatarsal ligaments that hold the metatarsal bones together. From there, the transverse head will run medially, and the oblique head will run at an oblique angle, and they will fuse once again at a point along the lateral aspect of the proximal phalanx, very close to its base. Next we have the flexor digiti minimi muscle. This is originating off the base of the fifth metatarsal bone and will insert along the lateral aspect of the base of the proximal phalanx. So as a result, it's once again going to flex the metacarpal phalangeal joint specifically for the fifth metacarpal. This takes us into the fourth and final muscular level, and again, a lot of similarity to what we saw with the hand, in that we have our dorsal interossei, and in this case plantar interossei, which are analogous to the dorsal and palmar interossei that we saw in the hand. Start with the dorsal interossei. If you remember from the hand, we essentially had two distinct heads which came off of either surface between the metacarpal bones. Well, in this case, they come off of the metatarsal bones in a very similar fashion. And similar to what we saw in the hand, because these are abductors of the digit, they will all attach along the surface of the proximal phalanx that is furthest away from the midline to be able to pull the respective digit away from the midline structure. So really, absolutely no difference from what we saw in the hand. The plantar interossei, also starting with P, once again, we see 3 of these muscles attached along the medial surface of the respective metatarsals, and their tendon inserts on the proximal portion of the proximal phalanx, which is closest to the midline, so that when they contract, they'll be able to draw the proximal phalanx and consequently the respective toe closer to the midline structure.